Sports broadcaster, pioneer Phyllis George, Basketball Hall of Fame coaches Jerry Sloan, Eddie Sutton, and Wes Unseld. Your microphone and chalkboards await you. Hi everyone, this is Will O'Toole welcoming you to another edition of Sports History, and I'd like to thank you for having me in your homes as we talk everything sports, about the people who have made the game such an interesting and worthwhile and memorable experience, both on the field, in the locker room, and behind the scenes. And this week, I'd like to pay tribute to a few people that have passed in the last few weeks. And as you saw by my cartoon, I'd like to talk about Phyllis George, one of the big women's sports pioneers in sports broadcasting, along with Jerry Sloan, Wes Unseld, and Eddie Sutton. And also I'd like to couple of shout outs to Al Kaline and maybe Jimmy the Toy Cannon Wynn, one of the greatest nicknames of the 60s and 70s that I had ever heard. And these are all people who were affiliated with sports that have passed away. And I'd like to pay some tribute to them. With that said, let's talk about Phyllis George, a comely-looking broadcaster, probably one of the best-looking ones that I saw back in the 70s. This is Phyllis with one of her broadcast partners, Brent Mutzberger. She started with NFL Today, and as a kid growing up, I couldn't understand why a woman was in the broadcast booth when there were so many guys that I thought were more capable. And then as you start to realize it, there are some women who just have as much knowledge of sports as some of the male counterparts. And for Phyllis George, who had quite a bit of, there was much criticism with her, she had to endure quite a bit of people just getting used to having a woman broadcaster in their living rooms on Sunday afternoon. But she did a pretty good job. And because of her, there have been breakthroughs by other female reporters and broadcasters. Actually, one of my favorite broadcasters today is a woman, and that's Doris Burke from ESPN. I think she does a great job. And she's just a real meat and potatoes type of broadcast. There's no real, showiness to her broadcast. She really does a nice job. And I'd like to see her get more gigs even do Big East Conference basketball games. I'd love to see it. She does a really unbelievable job doing the women's game, and I have heard her do some of the men's basketball, but she really does a nice job, and I really like her a lot. In that other booth, just as in the other broadcast partner with Brent and Phyllis George, was a guy who I always loved, Irv Cross. And again, I just mentioned the cliche meat and potatoes. Irv Cross was the same way. I was saying earlier that Irv was the type of guy you could sit down and have a beer at a bar, and he would explain the nuances of the games in real layman's terms that could really engage you and understand all the complexities and of each play and the responsibility of each player on the play. So he made football that much more enjoyable, and he didn't do it with a lot of football speak. Irv Cross was in my mind a perfect broadcaster. Like I said, meat and potatoes. Phyllis George was the same way. She came up through the ranks. Of course, probably a lot of people didn't like her because of her good looks. She was Miss America, I believe. And there was another reason probably why many people didn't like her. And the fact was, I think she was an out-and-out Dallas Cowboys fan. But you have to remember that the Cowboys, you either love them or hate them. At the time, I did like the Cowboys because they had two of my favorite players on those teams, Jeffro Pugh on the defensive side. And I just always loved Jeffro. I always admired the fact that during the Ice Bowl in Green Bay, he actually had 3 or 4 fingers that were frostbit. Thankfully, he didn't lose any of them, but he really had some real injuries to those digits during the Ice Bowl. And of course, on the other side was Heisman Trophy, All-American, and deemed Captain Comeback Roger Staubach, who really ascended during the 70s when football really made use. I mean, it started to be a player in the late 60s, but really in the 70s with the advent of a renewal of Monday Night Football. I mean, they had played at night in the past. I was looking in 1968, they actually played a Sunday night game or a Monday night game between Green Bay and Dallas, specifically for the TV ratings. This was after their two great championship games. And so not that Monday Night Football was anything novel, but what Monday Night Football did was it was a definite show, quote unquote, or a definite game set for each Monday. Nevertheless, the Cowboys seemed to be on TV every week, or if they weren't on TV every week, seemed like every other week. And every other week, Staubach was masterminding an unbelievable comeback, hence his nickname. But Phyllis George, she was in front and behind the scenes because if you recall, she married a fellow by the name of John Y. Brown, who was a businessman, multimillionaire, big basketball fan. He actually buys the Kentucky Colonels in the old ABA. They win a championship with Hubie Brown as their coach. I had to look that up, to be honest with you. I do recall that Hubie was the Kentucky Colonels coach. However, I thought it was somebody else. But I do remember players on that team, among them Louis Dampier, Dan Issel, and one of my personal favorites, Artis Gilmore. And they had other players. They had a very good team. They were just never brought into the fold because of finances into the ABA-NBA merger. But why John Y. Brown, though, gets to purchase the Buffalo Braves, who are now the San Diego Clippers, who are the LA Clippers. And those Braves teams had some good players on it. They had McAdoo, Ernie D., who was a rookie of the year. They had Randy Smith, who was an Iron Man. He wasn't the Lou Gehrig or the Cal Ripken in number of games played, but he was the same type of player. I think he has the record of starting the most games in a row. It's over 900 and something. I can't recall. Just goes to show you that baseball, it's in the thousands. In basketball, Randy Smith at one point had over 982 consecutive starts, whatever, in the NBA. Regardless, they had some good teams. Of course, he goes in, basically takes the team apart. He trades Adrian Dantley from that team, who had also won Rookie of the Year. Dantley, another one of my favorites. Undersized and always played underneath. And he was a very good, tough player that came out of D.C., the D.C. area, and goes on to Notre Dame. Dantley was on that team. Anyway, that whole team is transferred when he sells it to a guy named, I think, Ira Levine. And he transfers the team to California to become the San Diego Clippers and now the LA Clippers. And Y. Brown trades his franchise, Buffalo, to Levin for Levin's franchise, the Boston Celtics. Now, the reason I bring up the Celtics, of course, they're the Yankees, the Canadians of the NBA. But with John Y. Brown at the helm, he puts his fingerprints all over that team, and they fall flat on their face. This was the dark days of Dave Cowens. Remember, there were nights where he was a hack driving a taxi cab. And I like Dave Cowens, never liked the Celtics. But Celtics fans should think about this. Had the Celtics not been so terrible, maybe they don't get Larry Bird and then, bring them back to ascendancy with Red Auerbach once again. Always seeing that nugget, that gold in them there hills that other people haven't spotted. Quite a prospector. But that's the whole kind of in a nutshell with Phyllis George. But she paves a path. And I listen, whether you liked her broadcast or not, whether you liked her interviews or not, whether you liked her presence on the TV show, you have to give her this. She was brave enough and courageous enough to do that and really lead a path for other women broadcasters and sportscasters and writers to fulfill their dreams as well. And I think it's made all the games much, much better. Another, I like to do a little bit of Jerry Sloan. One thing I realized, I knew this all the time, but I have to be fair. I didn't know this. Jerry Sloan, and here's his basketball card. I originally thought this was from the 70s, but now as I look at it again, the 1970 or 71 edition was this huge rectangular cardboard one, and it was very thick, different from all the cards that we have today. They're more square, but these were real rectangular. They look like this, actually. But what I didn't realize with Sloan is, he was the coach of the Bulls after he retires. He is the first Bull drafted in the expansion draft. He came over from the Baltimore Bullets. Did not know that. Did know he went to University of Evansville. Did know he was an all-star. He was a two-timer. And goes on and has success with Utah after leaving Chicago, basically getting fired. Struggled there a little bit, even with Artis Gilmore in the center spot. Goes to Utah, really transforms that franchise, because you have to remember the Utah Jazz were the New Orleans Jazz, and they stunk. And they move out to Utah, have a better season out there. Sloan has 13 seasons where he wins 50 or more games. Not bad. He had Stockton and Malone, but to be fair to Stockton, Malone, and to Sloan, they were a good team, not a great team, and they were always maybe, a dollar short and a day late in terms of their success on the court. That's not being disparaging. It's just that they were always competing with the Lakers, and if it wasn't the Lakers, then it was the Spurs. And of course, the Spurs have one of the great all-time players in Duncan, and we don't even have to talk about LA with Magic and Kareem and all the rest of it. And the funny thing is, the irony with Jerry Sloan is that his coaching career kind of mirrors his playing career in this way. He was a hard-nosed player. Utah was known for being a hard-nosed team. He got the most out of his players. I think he got the most out of his talent. He did average double digits while he was there. But Chicago also had good teams that won 50 games, it seemed, every year in the early 70s. And they had a team that consisted of Malone and Van Leer. And Van Leer was a pretty good defensive guard, not much of a shooter. But they had two good defensive players up top, and they had two bookend forwards. Chet Walker played for the 67 Sixers, and Bob Love. And they had in the center post, they had three centers that revolved for the most part there. They had Tom Boerwinkle, Dennis Autry, whose better days were at Santa Clara. And then they would later get Clifford Ray, who would be traded to San Francisco and play for Golden State and win their championship back in 74-75. But they didn't have those three centers. None of them could match up with Kareem Abdul-Jabbar and those Buck teams of the early 70s. You have to recall that with Sloan and Van Leer up top, they had to defend or play against the great Oscar Robertson. Yes, probably past his prime, but still a very productive player, even with the Bucks. The Bucks had John McLaughlin, and they had other good players on that team. Bobby Dandridge, who would later go on and play with the the Washington, the Capitol Bullets, and where he would win also a championship. So he won with the Bucks and with the Bullets. Anyway, the Bulls always came up short there too, always losing in a game 7, it seemed. And they had a good team, just never could get over the top. And you'll see that in many, many sports where teams are good enough to get maybe there, but just not enough to get past that. They're just missing one component, one element, and they could never really put their thumb on it. I think the Bulls' problems with those Sloan teams was the fact that nobody could contend with Jabbar in the middle, no matter who they put there. Segue into Eddie Sutton, who in an earlier missed broadcast, I was saying Sean Sutton, but that Sean Sutton is his father's son, does become a coach. Eddie Sutton was a remarkable coach. I particularly remember him being at the University of Arkansas and leading the Razorbacks, one of the great nicknames in all sports, to the 78 Final Four, where they lose to Kentucky, the eventual champion, but they beat Notre Dame in the consolation game. But Sutton had 16 seasons of 20-plus wins. I was just looking. He coached at Creighton, Arkansas, Oklahoma State, and Kentucky. He brought them all to the NCAAs. He was a remarkable coach. Yes, some people might say there's a stain because of NCAA allegations against him. A shame. I'm not going to hit that because, I'll just keep some of the NCAA allegations out of this for now, because it seems to me so many times that the NCAA seems to get you for a nickel dime and allows other transgressions to grow and metastasize and do nothing about it. I just want to say that Eddie Sutton was a good coach, really a remarkable coach, and he made Arkansas into a brand name for college basketball, because Arkansas, like any of the other Southern and Southwest teams, always known for football. Sutton really put them on the map for being a good basketball place to play. In fact, when in '78, when they do make the Final Four, one of his players, I believe it was Marvin Delph, graces the cover of SI. I never forget. I think it's February 2nd, 1978 cover, and he's dunking the ball, hands behind. It seems like he's 100 feet in the air about to dunk. And, maybe I'll show that in a future broadcast. Just don't have the time right now to find it. But that really was the epitome of those teams. Fast, defensive-oriented, great athletes, and they were good kids that Sutton coached. Sutton and Sloan, now, they do remind me of this, though. When I look at them, they remind me of, they would have made great cowboys in the old 1960s TV Westerns. This is one of the many shows that were prevalent back in the 60s. The Bonanzas, the Virginian, the Paladin, Have Gun Will Travel, all these, Laramie. But they just seem that if you put these type of hats on both Sloan and Eddie Sutton, you'd have a good cowboy or a really good outlaw. Next, Wes Unseld. This is basically the card I was talking about. I'm pretty sure this is 70 or 71. I'm pretty sure now that as I'm saying it to you, it is probably 1971. But they were long and rectangular and very thick. And of course, Wes Unseld, that was the Baltimore Bullets. They were orange then. And of course, then they moved, where they changed the name of the franchise to encompass both Baltimore and Washington to become the Capitol Bullets. Then they became the Washington Bullets, I believe, and now their new name, the Washington Wizards. But those Bullet teams of the early 70s, like those Chicago teams, I think about it now, had players like Wes Unseld, Jack Marin, Archie Clark, and they always came up a dollar short to the New York Knicks. And of course, they even had Earl Monroe. And Earl Monroe doesn't win his championship until he's traded for Mike Reardon to the New York Knicks. And Wes Unseld, I always thought, we always talk about Charles Barkley being an undersized power forward. It's, they listed him as 6'7", maybe 6'7.5", but in reality, he was about 6'4". Wes Unseld, I think if you added the afro that he sported in the 1960s, may have been reaching it 6'7", 6'8". And yet he contended against the likes of Willis Reed, a couple inches taller than him. He went against Chamberlain. He went against Alcindor/Jabbar. And he made his mark. Look, he won a championship, 77-78. He won Rookie of the Year and MVP in 69. And obviously only one other player has done that. And of course, the first guy you think of is maybe a Larry Bird or a Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, but it was actually Wilt Chamberlain. Of course, but those are three all-time greats. And here's Wes Unseld doing something that neither Jabbar or Bird was able to accomplish. He was a really good player. Now, obviously, is he an elite center? Probably not. Can you win with him? Obviously, you can, because the Bullets, for all those years, were competitive. They went to championships. You got to recall, he went to 2 championships, 2 straight years where they played Seattle in the late 70s. They fortunately won, in the second in the rematch with the Seattle Sonics. And Unseld did a great job. All right? He did a great job. As I'm looking at some of his stats, Unseld, in his NBA career, he played 984 games. His first 2 years, he played all 82. And as a player, he averaged. Of course, they don't really give the average. It's the only thing. He was known more for his rebounding, but, he was double digits every year in points. And, of course, he played alongside Elvin Hayes. They had Bobby Dandridge that they would later go on. Archie Clark, Mike Reardon. These are just players. He did play with, like I said, Earl Monroe, but he did have some scoring machines on that team with the Big E and Monroe, and really handled the position quite well. And he's a Hall of Famer. Not the best NBA coach, maybe bad circumstances, bad talent, whatever. He'll be known more for his playing prowess rather than his coaching. But Wes Unseld, I had to do something for him. He's just a really good guy. And I always, as a kid, got him confused. And the funny thing is, as you get older, you see it. Here's Wes. Well, here he is. This is the basketball card from 1971. Excuse me. All right, those are the rebound leaders. And look, all of them Hall of Famers. Elvin Hayes with the San Diego/Houston Rockets. Wes Unseld, Lou Alcindor. But underneath this, here's Wes Unseld. Tell me he doesn't remind you of, let me just see, because just like with the Cowboys, I was thinking he always reminded me of this. Clarence Williams, everybody knows him from the 1970 show, The Mod Squad. But look at how much, to me, they remind one another. He goes on. I don't have the older picture of Clarence Williams, but I always thought that Clarence Williams, as a kid, this is what you're thinking, and Wes Unseld were very much, they looked alike. Last guy I want to talk about, Al Kaline. Oh, here's the Clarence Williams, the older one. Okay, very similar, I think, to Wes Unseld in my mind. All right, lookalikes. I love doing that. And of course, I had Sloan and Sutton as lookalikes with the old Cowboy Outlaws of the 60s. 1970 card. I know this because I had it. And this was the first set I ever owned, so it's very near and dear. Not maybe the best Al Kaline cards, if you're talking about it. Remember, I was showing you last week, but it is unique. Obviously taken at Yankee Stadium because you can see the white arches up there of Yankee Stadium. And Detroit always loved it that they had the little number or the number on the patch. I always thought that was pretty good. Very bland, but, very baseball-like uniforms. But Kaline is a unique guy in this respect. I always thought, I don't think he's an upper echelon player. I don't think he's in the realm of Kaline. Kaline's not in the realm of, let's say, Aaron and Mays, Clemente, Williams. But always thought he was more like, you could put him in the classification of Yaz and that sort. I may be wrong about that. Did have a career WAR, I know that's the big thing, of 92.8. All right. The great ones have it over 100, so he's right up there. He averaged, I knew this for a fact, he had 399 home runs. It's too bad he didn't hit the 400. He did finish with 3,007 hits. He was more interested, I think, later in his career, he would talk about that he was interested in getting his 3,000 hit. And he did say later on, when he found out that he finished one shy of 400, he said, I should have stayed and waited and gotten the 300, my 400th home run. The shame of it is he finished with a 297 batting average. He's really a 300 hitter. But here's what I really wanted to talk about. Now, you have to remember that these Tiger teams of the early, the mid 50s, 60s, and 70s, they are putting a core group together for that run at 68. So they had a good team in 68, 67, maybe 66. But in his early years in the 50s and stuff, they were just mediocre at best. They would have their occasional 85-win season, but they're mostly they always seem to be like 77 and 78 more. 77 and 78 and 76, because they played 154 up until 1961. This, though, is the respect that Kaline had among his peers and among the writers. He finished in the MVP vote from 1954 to 1967. You're talking about 14 years. He finished 23rd, 2, 3, 10, 20, 6. Excuse me, he didn't make it in 1960. Or in MVP, 1961, he finished 9th. Then 6, 2, 14, 16, 7, and 5. So basically, he had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. He had 7 top 10 appearances in the MVP. Who did he lose to in 55? MVP that year. Ready? Let me click it on, because I'm pretty sure it's Yogi. Can we have it here? MVP that year was Yogi Berra. Kaline finished behind him. Yet, if you want to argue this, I know the baseball metric guys will argue this, his WAR was almost double that of Berra's. His was 8.3, Yogi's was 4.5. They both hit 27 home runs. Berra had 6 more RBIs. Kaline, though, he had 37 more runs scored that year, and his batting average was 340. He actually led the league, and he was only, I think, 20 in his early 20s. Maybe he was 20, the youngest player to win the batting title in the American League. The next year, MVP. I mean, this is Kaline on teams that were terrible. Kaline finished 3rd behind Mantle and Berra. 57. He finishes 10th, but the winner was Mantle. Who finished 2nd? Ted Williams. So Kaline was quite an unbelievable ball player. Probably a fellow like me, probably overlooked. You got to remember, though, he was coming down in his career as I was just starting to follow baseball. What hurt him in 68, the one year that the Tigers win the pennant and then the World Series, as he's hurt for most of the year. And being the classy guy, he actually went to the manager, Mayo Smith, and said, look, I'm back. You play the team that got you here. And actually, Mayo did need him, because he inserted him in right field and took Mickey Stanley from center and put him at shortstop for those 7 games against the Cardinals. It was really amazing, because here's the thing. Mayo, had he lost maybe that 7th game to the Cardinals, might have been under the same scrutiny that John McNamara in 86 for having maybe a Bill Buckner in a game 6 with the Mets instead of replacing him. Because if you recall, McNamara probably kept him in, and I think he does say this later on, that he kept him in because he had waited so long. And with with the lead that they had, the fact it was game 6, figured what damage could it have happened. And we all know what happened. And it's really unfair, because the Red Sox do have a 3-0 lead in the following night, game 7, or 2 nights later, because it was rain and all the rest of it. But Kaline does do well in that 68 season. He does get into the World Series. The Tigers do win. And it really just goes to show you the respect that Mayo Smith had for him. Yes, you shouldn't lose maybe your position due to injury and stuff, but the team was going on all cylinders. And many people say, well, why wreck it? Mayo Smith took a huge risk by putting Stanley at short. As it was, turns out to be a godsend, because Tigers win one of their few championships. When I was a kid, I always thought the Tigers were pretty good because you think of Cobb and Heilman and Sam Wahoo Crawford. And yes, the Kalines. And growing up, I had Norm Cash, and I loved this guy, Willie Horton, because I could do his stance like crazy. But really, when you think about it, they weren't that all that successful franchise on the field. 68, they hadn't won in years, in decades. Even today, I think of the Tigers, 84. It's 36 years ago. That's the last time they won a championship, a World Series, rather. So Kaline was a big fixture in the Tigers. Probably, I don't know, he's probably a Mount Rushmore Tiger for certain. But just goes to show you, when you start to dig and you say, Kaline was a pretty good player. And then you start to say, yeah, but he's not Mays. He's not, he doesn't have that charisma of a Mays. The consistency of, let's say, an Aaron. He really did. Now, as I said, same level? Probably not. But when you're looking at the awards and you're starting to say, wow, he did have a lot of respect. And this is a shout out to my brother Eddie, who told me this. Kaline actually threw out in one game 3 guys at 3 different bases. And I think, as my brother told me, and I could be wrong about this, so don't blame my brother, blame me on this. I think he threw out a runner at second, then a runner at third, and a runner at home in that order in one game. Kaline was both a very good outfielder defensively and a very good hitter. And it's just a shame that he finished with 399 and 297. Hey, thank you for listening. This is Will O'Toole. I invite you to another episode of Sports History. I thank you for your time, and I thank you also for listening and tuning in. I'll see you. Bye now.